She had not opened the mailbox in 3 days, and when she finally did, the handwriting on the envelope stopped her cold, the looping, unmistakable cursive of a man the whole town believed had been dead for 20 years. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, subscribe to the Afro Soul Heartstrings and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Margaret Calloway had a system for everything. That was what happened when you spent 31 years as a school librarian. You developed routines the way other people developed bad habits, quietly and completely, until you could not imagine life without them. She woke at 6:15 every morning, made a single cup of coffee in the percolator her mother had left her, and sat at the kitchen table for exactly 20 minutes before getting dressed. She watered her plants on Tuesdays and Fridays. She called her daughter Nora every Sunday at 7. She checked the mail on her way back from her afternoon walk, between 4 and 4:30, never before and never after. The system had kept her steady through the worst years. Through her husband Dale's death from a stroke 8 years ago. Through Nora moving to Portland with her fiancé. Through the retirement party at the library where everyone hugged her a little too tightly, the way people hug someone they feel sorry for. The system was not excitement. It was not happiness, exactly. But it was hers, and it held her together the way a frame holds a painting, invisibly, completely. The town of Grover Falls, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where nothing much happened twice. It had one diner, one hardware store, a post office that closed at noon on Wednesdays, and a kind of collective memory that stretched back generations. People there did not forget things. They did not forget the flood of 1987 that took out the old bridge, or the fire at the Hendersons' barn, or the summer that Tommy Whitfield disappeared. That was what everyone called it. The summer Tommy disappeared. Because no one ever found a body, and no one ever found a reason, and the not knowing had become its own kind of fact, hardening over 20 years into something the town carried without examining too closely. Tommy Whitfield had been 32 years old. He had worked at the grain elevator, coached Little League on weekends, and been engaged to a woman named Carol Briggs, who eventually married someone else and moved to Ohio. He had walked out of his apartment on a Thursday evening in July and simply ceased to exist. Margaret had known Tommy. Everyone in Grover Falls had known Tommy. He had been one of her library regulars when he was a boy, all knobby elbows and serious eyes, checking out books about astronomy and deep-sea creatures, always returning them exactly on time. She had been fond of him the way librarians become fond of quiet, curious children. She had cried at the memorial service his mother held 2 years after his disappearance, when the family finally accepted what the town already suspected. So when Margaret pulled the envelope from her mailbox on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October and saw the handwriting, she did not immediately think of Tommy Whitfield. She thought she was confused. She thought it was the light, or her eyes, or simply a coincidence of penmanship. Then she read the name in the top left corner of the envelope. T. Whitfield. 414, Crane Road. There was no city. No state. No zip code. Just the road name, written in that same careful cursive, the letters formed with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been taught penmanship the old way, with a ruler and repetition. Margaret stood at the mailbox for a very long time. A car passed on the street behind her, its tires wet from the earlier rain. A crow landed on the telephone wire above her head and watched her with one black eye. She went inside. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and stood across the room from it, arms crossed, as if it might do something. She had not touched the coffee maker. She had not taken off her coat. The envelope sat under the overhead light, cream-colored and slightly thick, as though it contained more than a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Tommy's. She was almost certain of it, which made no sense, because she had not seen Tommy Whitfield's handwriting in over 20 years and memory was not reliable. Everyone knew that, memory shifted and rearranged itself constantly. She was 67 years old. She had catalogued tens of thousands of books. She could not possibly recognize someone's handwriting after 2 decades. But she did. She was almost sure she did. She called Nora at 7, as always, and said nothing about the letter. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, she opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written on both sides of thin notebook paper in the same careful cursive. There was no greeting at the top. It simply began, as though picking up a conversation that had paused mid-sentence. I know this will be strange to receive. I know you may not believe it is from me. I am not sure I would believe it either, if our positions were reversed. But I am writing to you specifically because I always trusted you, even when I was young, and because I need someone to understand what happened before I can come back. I need someone to know the truth before I can face what comes next. I am alive. I have been alive this entire time. What I did was wrong. I have known that for years. But I want you to understand why I did it before you judge me, or before you call anyone. Please read this in full before you do anything. That is all I ask. Margaret read it 3 times without stopping. The letter did not explain where Tommy was. It did not give an address or a phone number. It gave a story, partial, carefully worded, full of gaps that felt deliberate rather than accidental. According to the letter, Tommy had left Grover Falls not because of something criminal, as some people had suspected over the years, and not because of a breakdown, as others had assumed. He had left because of something he had seen. Something involving people in the town he had trusted, in a situation he had not known how to handle and had been too frightened to report. He did not name names. Not yet, the letter said. Not yet. I will write again. I need to know you received this first. I need to know you are willing to hear the rest. At the bottom, he had written a single instruction: do not contact the police. Not yet. Please. Margaret sat at her kitchen table until noon. Then she did something she had not done in years. She drove to the library. Patricia Morse had taken over as head librarian 4 years ago, when Margaret retired. She was efficient and organized and had introduced a digital cataloging system that Margaret privately found unnecessary. But she was also trustworthy, and she owed Margaret several professional favors from the transition period, and she had access to the archived local newspaper records going back 60 years. Margaret did not tell Patricia why she needed to look at the coverage from the summer Tommy disappeared. She said she was writing something, a personal project, and Patricia, who had learned over the years not to ask Margaret too many questions, led her into the archive room without comment. She spent 2 hours reading. She had forgotten some of the details. The police had interviewed dozens of people. There had been a brief period when a man from out of town had been considered a person of interest before being cleared. Tommy's employer at the grain elevator, a man named Harlan Voss, had been interviewed 3 times, which had struck some people as unusual at the time. Harlan Voss had died of cancer 6 years ago. His son, Dennis Voss, now ran the elevator. Margaret wrote down the name Dennis Voss in the small notebook she carried in her purse. She did not know why exactly. Instinct, perhaps. Or the beginning of something she could not yet identify. She drove home. She checked the mailbox. Nothing. She waited. The second letter arrived 9 days later. She almost missed it. She had begun checking the mailbox twice a day, morning and afternoon, which was a break in her system that bothered her more than she liked to admit. By the 9th day she had half convinced herself that the whole thing had been a prank, or a mistake, or some elaborate misunderstanding she would eventually be able to explain away. She had almost talked herself into calling the police, not to report anything specific, just to ask, hypothetically, what a person was supposed to do if they received a letter from someone who had been missing for 20 years. The second envelope was thicker than the first. She opened it on the porch, which she had never done before, in the cold October air, because she could not wait until she was inside. This letter was 7 pages. It began where the first had left off, with the same abruptness, the same quality of a conversation resumed. Asterisk the summer I left, I saw something I was not supposed to see. I want to be careful how I say this because I do not want to make accusations I cannot prove, even now. But I think you deserve the truth, since you are the one I've chosen to trust with this, asterisk. Asterisk Harlan Voss was moving money. Large amounts of it, through the elevator accounts. I found out by accident, a bill of lading that was left on the desk when I came in early one morning, numbers that did not match anything in the legitimate ledger. I was young. I did not fully understand what I was looking at. But I knew enough to know it was wrong, and I knew enough to know that the men whose names appeared on those documents were not the kind of men you reported, asterisk. He named 2 names Margaret did not recognize. Then he named a third that made her grip the pages more tightly. She read it again to make sure she had understood correctly. The third name was a man who had, in the years since Tommy's disappearance, become a well-known figure in the county. A man who currently sat on the county board of supervisors. A man whose photograph appeared in the local paper several times a year, usually at ribbon cuttings or charity events, usually smiling. I went to Harlan and told him what I had seen. I don't know what I thought. That he would explain it, maybe. That there would be some reason I had misunderstood. Instead, he told me that if I repeated what I had seen to anyone, the consequences would be severe. He did not threaten me directly. He was smarter than that. He told me about a man in a neighboring county who had caused problems for certain people, and what had happened to that man's family. He said it as a piece of local history. Just information. He wanted me to understand my situation. I understood it. I had 3 days to decide what to do. I packed what I could carry. I left. The letter paused there, moved into what had come after, years of moving, of working jobs that paid in cash, of living in the margins of places, of gradually building something that resembled a life without resembling his old one. He had been in 4 different states. He was no longer in any of them, the letter implied, though it did not say where he was now. The last paragraph stopped Margaret completely. I am coming back. I have decided. It has taken me 20 years to decide, and I understand what I am walking into, and I am not sure I will come out of it the way I'm hoping. But I cannot live like this anymore. I want to come home. I need someone on the ground there who knows the truth in case something happens to me when I do. I chose you because you were always honest. And because you have nothing to lose. Margaret folded the letter very carefully. She sat with the phrase for a long time. You have nothing to lose. She was not sure whether it was an insult or a compliment. She was not sure Tommy had meant it as either. She suspected he had simply meant it as the truth, which was somehow the most unsettling possibility of all. She thought about it for 3 days before she told anyone. The person she told was not her daughter, though she considered it. Nora was practical and loving and would immediately tell her to go to the police and then spend 4 days calling repeatedly to make sure she had. Margaret was not ready for that yet. The person she told was Frank Okafor, who had been the town's only pharmacist for 30 years and who was one of the few people in Grover Falls Margaret trusted unconditionally. Frank was 71, recently widowed, and possessed of the particular calm that comes from having heard everyone's medical secrets for 3 decades without repeating a single one. He had known Tommy Whitfield. He had been at the memorial service. She showed him both letters over coffee at his kitchen table. He read them without speaking. When he finished, he set them down and looked at her for a long moment. How certain are you it's his handwriting? Not completely. But certain enough. Frank turned the pages over. He mentions the county supervisor. Yes. That's not a small thing, Margaret. I know it isn't. What do you want to do? And that was the question, wasn't it? She had been asking herself that for 3 days and had not arrived at a clean answer. She wanted to believe the letters were real. She also wanted to be cautious, because believing something desperately was a good way to stop seeing it clearly. She wanted to protect Tommy, whoever and wherever he was, from whatever might happen if the wrong people learned he was planning to return. And she wanted, if she was being completely honest, to understand why he had chosen her. "You have nothing to lose. I want to wait for the next letter," she said. "And I want to find out more about what was happening at that elevator 20 years ago." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Dennis Voss runs it now." "I know. Dennis Voss is not his father." "I know that too." Frank picked up his coffee cup. "I went to school with Dennis. He was a decent kid. He might not know anything about what his father was involved in." He paused. "Or he might know everything." Margaret looked out Frank's kitchen window at the bare autumn trees. "Tommy said the man on the county board is still involved. That means whatever it was, it didn't stop 20 years ago. It just kept going." The silence between them had weight. "If that's true," Frank said slowly, "then whoever it involves is not going to want Tommy Whitfield coming home." The third letter arrived 2 weeks later. By that point Margaret had done something she had not told Frank about. She had called her son-in-law, David, who was an attorney in Portland, not a criminal attorney. He handled real estate, but he knew people, and she had explained the situation to him carefully and asked him, without telling Nora, to look into what protections might exist for someone in Tommy's position. A person who had technically not committed any crime but had disappeared voluntarily and lived under a different name for 20 years. David had been alarmed. David had said several things that Margaret had listened to politely and largely set aside. But he had also made some calls, and what he told her in a follow-up conversation was that there was a legal framework for Tommy's situation, that if he had witnessed what the letters described and had documentation to support it, there were channels, there were people who handled this kind of thing, and that it was not as hopeless as it might seem. The third letter was the shortest. Only 1 page. Asterisk I know you've probably talked to someone by now. That's all right. I would have done the same, asterisk. Asterisk I have documentation. I kept copies of everything I saw that morning, and over the years I've gathered more. I know that sounds unlikely. But I was frightened and I was careful, and I have kept these documents through every move I've made. They are not stored with me. They are safe, asterisk. Asterisk I am planning to arrive in Grover Falls on November 14th. That is 3 weeks from when I am writing this. I will come to you first, asterisk. Asterisk if I don't arrive by November 16th, please give this letter, and the others, to whoever you've trusted. You'll know what to do, asterisk. Asterisk the one thing I ask is that you don't tell anyone I'm coming until I'm there. Once I arrive, I can handle the rest. But if the wrong people find out before I'm in the room where I can say what I know, with a lawyer present and documentation in hand, then everything falls apart. I have wanted to come home for a long time. I am scared. I want you to know that. I am not brave. I have just run out of road. Margaret read the letter 3 times. November 14th. She counted the days. 19 of them. She would spend 19 days knowing that Tommy Whitfield was somewhere in the country, moving toward Grover Falls, carrying 20 years of silence toward the surface like something that had been submerged and was finally, inevitably rising. She did not sleep well. She went through her routines. She watered her plants. She called Nora on Sunday. She did not mention any of it. But she began, quietly, to prepare. She talked to Frank every few days. He had done some careful asking around about the county supervisor, enough to know that the man's finances were considerably more comfortable than his county salary should have allowed, and that he had maintained a long business relationship with the grain elevator even after Harlan Voss's death. None of that was proof of anything. It was the texture of something, an impression rather than evidence. But it fit the shape of what Tommy had described. Frank also told her that Dennis Voss had stopped in at the pharmacy a week earlier and seemed unusually tense. Dennis had made small talk about nothing for 10 minutes before leaving without buying anything, which Frank said was strange because Dennis was not usually a man who made small talk. "Do you think he knows something?" Margaret asked. "I think he might be worried about something," Frank said. "Which is not quite the same thing." On November 10th, 4 days before Tommy was supposed to arrive, something happened that Margaret had not anticipated. Her front door bell rang at 8 in the evening. When she looked through the peephole, she saw a man she did not know. He was somewhere in his 40s, wearing a canvas jacket, and he was not looking at the door. He was looking back over his shoulder at the street. She did not open the door. She waited. After a minute, he rang again. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something white, an envelope, and slid it through the mail slot. She heard his footsteps retreating down the porch steps. She waited a full 10 minutes before she picked it up. This envelope was different. Her name and address were printed, not handwritten. Inside was a single index card. "Tell him not to come. They already know." No signature. No other information. Margaret sat down on her hallway floor, which she had never done before in her life. Her hands were not steady. She sat there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she got up, went to the phone, and called Frank. Frank came over immediately. He read the index card and then looked at her with the particular expression he had when he was very concerned but did not want to show it too clearly. "Someone is warning him," Margaret said. "Which means someone else knows he's coming. Or someone is trying to scare you off," Frank said. "To keep you from helping him." Both things could be true simultaneously. She understood that. The warning could be genuine and also designed to frighten her into withdrawing, into deciding this was not her responsibility, into letting Tommy walk into something without anyone knowing the full picture. "I don't have a way to contact him," she said. "He never gave me an address or a number. Everything was one direction." Frank set the card down. "Then we have to assume he's already on his way. And we have to decide what to do." "David said there's a federal contact," Margaret said. "Someone who handles financial crime cases at the regional level. Someone outside the county. That's different from the local police." "Yes." Deliberately. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Then, if you make that call, there's no taking it back. Everything moves faster." "I know." Tommy said to wait until he arrived. "Tommy didn't know someone would slide a note through my door." Frank picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. Outside, the wind was moving through the oak tree in the front yard, and they could hear it, a low persistent sound like the house settling. "Make the call," Frank said. Margaret called David that night. David, who had been quietly maintaining the contact for the past month, made the introduction. By the following afternoon, Margaret had spoken, briefly and carefully, to a woman named Agent Carla Sims, who worked out of a regional office and who listened to everything Margaret said with the focused patience of someone who had heard many things and was not easily surprised. Margaret gave her the letters. Copies, because she kept the originals in the fireproof box under her bed where she kept Dale's will and her own important documents. She gave her the index card too. Agent Sims said she could not tell Margaret what she knew or didn't know. She said she could tell Margaret that if Tommy Whitfield arrived on November 14th, there were people who would be positioned to help him. She said that Margaret should continue her normal routines and should not approach or confront anyone locally. She also said, "You did the right thing." Margaret thanked her and hung up and then stood in her kitchen for a very long time, looking at the percolator her mother had left her, thinking about all the cups of coffee she had made in this room over the years and all the ordinary mornings she would have traded for nothing. She thought about Tommy Whitfield as a boy, 8 or 9 years old, sliding a book about Saturn across the library counter with both hands. She thought about the memorial service. She thought about the 20 years he had spent running, and what they must have cost him, and how strange and lonely it must have been to build a life that was not your life, in places that were not your place. She had nothing to lose. Maybe that was the only kind of person who could do this. November 14th arrived cold and clear. Margaret went through her entire system. Coffee at 6:15. 20 minutes at the kitchen table. She watered her plants, even though it was not a Tuesday or a Friday, because she needed something to do with her hands. She called Nora at 10 in the morning, which was unusual, and Nora immediately asked if she was all right, and Margaret said yes, she was fine, she had just been thinking about her and wanted to hear her voice. Which was the truth, even if it was not the whole truth. She checked the mailbox at 4. Nothing. She checked it again at 6. Still nothing. At 7:15, someone knocked on the back door. She had not thought about the back door. She had spent 2 weeks thinking about the front door, the mailbox, the street, and Tommy Whitfield had knocked on the back door. She stood in her kitchen. She looked at the door. She could see through the small window in it, the dark of the backyard, the shape of a man who was thinner than she remembered, older obviously, with a beard and a coat that had seen better years. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately, even through the glass, even across 20 years. It was the expression of someone who had been very far away for a very long time and was not yet sure they had permission to come back. She opened the door. He stood on the porch step and she stood in the kitchen doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment that expanded in the way certain moments do, quietly and completely, until it contained more than its ordinary dimensions could hold. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered and rougher at the edges, but the cadence of it was the same careful deliberateness as the letters. "I'm sorry to come to the back." "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He came in. He stood in her kitchen and looked around at the percolator and the plants and the table and the ordinary architecture of a life lived carefully, and his face did something complicated. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door," he said. "I wasn't sure I would either," she said. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." She had called Frank as soon as Tommy sat down, and Frank came within 15 minutes, and together they spent 2 hours at the kitchen table while Tommy talked. He talked the way the letters had been written, carefully, with attention to detail, occasionally stopping to gather something before continuing. He was 52 years old. He looked 60 in some angles and 40 in others. He was frightened and he was determined, and he was, underneath all of it, something Margaret recognized from his boyhood visits to the library, genuinely, deeply relieved to be speaking the truth out loud to someone who was listening. The documents were not with him. They were in a safety deposit box in another city, the key held by a lawyer Tommy had worked with, prepared for this moment. He had made sure that whatever happened to him, the information had a path forward. Agent Sims arrived at 10:30, with a colleague. She had been waiting, she explained, at a location nearby, which was how Margaret understood that they had been taken seriously, that the calls had mattered, that the slow careful work of the past 3 weeks had built into something real. Tommy looked at the agents and then looked at Margaret. "You called them," he said. "It was not an accusation." "Someone slid a warning through my mail slot," she said. "I didn't have a way to reach you. I didn't know what else to do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "That was Dennis Voss," he said. "He found out somehow that I was coming. He sent the note. I think he was trying to help. His father's business," Frank said. "He's known for years. He never participated, but he knew. I think it's been eating at him." Tommy looked at his hands on the table. "There are things that eat at people when they can't put them down." The agents took him to a different location that night. Before he left, he paused in Margaret's kitchen doorway, the back door again, she noticed, and turned to look at her. "Why did you keep the letters?" he asked. "You could have thrown them away. You could have told yourself it was a prank and gone back to your life." Margaret considered the question. It was a fair one. She had asked it to herself several times over the past 3 weeks. "Because you trusted me," she said finally. And I wasn't going to be the reason that trust was wasted. He looked at her for a long moment. He seemed like he might say something else. Then he simply nodded, and thanked her, and walked out into the November dark. The county supervisor resigned the following March, before the charges were formally announced. The announcement was a local story for 2 weeks and then a regional story briefly, and then it settled into the kind of news that people in Grover Falls folded into their collective memory alongside everything else: the flood of 1987, the Henderson barn, the summer Tommy disappeared. Except now they knew what that summer had really been. Now it had a different ending. Tommy did not move back to Grover Falls. Margaret had not expected him to. He had spent 20 years becoming someone else somewhere else, and a person could not simply reverse that, even if they wanted to, even if they had the legal space to try. He settled, she learned through channels she did not fully understand, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He called her once, in the spring, a brief conversation that covered very little ground but confirmed that he was all right, that the process was moving slowly but moving, that he was grateful. She told him he didn't owe her anything. He said that wasn't the point. She thought about that for a while after they hung up. On Tuesdays and Fridays, she watered her plants. On Sundays she called Nora. She walked in the afternoons and checked the mailbox between 4 and 4:30. She made her coffee at 6:15 and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes and watched the light change in the yard. The system held. It had always held. But something in it had shifted in a way she could not quite name, not broken, not different, exactly. Deepened, perhaps. As though the routine had acquired a dimension it had not possessed before, a small persistent awareness that ordinary mornings were worth protecting, that careful lives were not small lives, and that sometimes the most significant thing a person could do was simply refuse to put a letter down and walk away. She was 67 years old. She had a percolator her mother had left her. She had plants that needed water twice a week and a daughter who called on Sundays and a friend who came quickly when she called and did not ask unnecessary questions. She had, it turned out, quite a lot to lose. And she was glad of it.